I know many of you that were here last week are waiting on pins and needles for the epic conclusion to what happened to my car, aren't you? I know you are. I got a lot of people very interested in this, by the way, but, we kept saying, a lot can happen in a week, which I love. Well, guess what? A lot can happen in a week. On Monday last week, I was talking about my car, and it was this huge saga. If you missed it, I'm telling you, you're missing out here, but it was this epic saga of me and the auto repair mechanic going back and forth. And at the end it said, you're going to need a new engine. Right? Well, on Monday, so I went and I just said, you know what? Let me go pick it up. Not going to do that right away. So I go to drive it, and, I go to work. All the lights are on and everything, but I'm driving. It's okay, right? So at this point, we're just going to let it ride, y'all. God's in control. We'll just see what happens. So I get to work, clock in, go about my day. I go to my lunch break. I drive to grab some lunch, something really healthy, just, I drive to get something really healthy for lunch. Lights on, all the weird alerts, rough light, all that. And I come back, and then when I go to drive home in the evening after work, all the error lights are gone. Weird, huh? All right. So we'll see how long that rolls for. But point of that is that, really God is in control. And yeah, hey, a lot can happen in a week. And, we talked about this idea of what's next. We just came out of the Easter season, and we're saying how you ask the question of what's next is really important. Either it can be what's next, like what's the next thing that's going to add up? I've been through so many things, and so many things have happened to me, and like what's next? We talked about being lost in the moment, maybe a little confused on where to go next and saying, well what's next? I don't know. But then we talked about asking the question of what's next, really looking forward with hope and optimism as Christians in our world, different than those around us. We talked about what's next for the sick, that they can find healing. What's next for the broken, that they can find restoration. What's next for the lost? They can find community and connection. What's next for the burden? They can find that God will take that and God will be with us. And so the promises of hope and healing, of restoration, of community, and all of these things are part of the Easter message empowered by the resurrection. And so we looked at Luke 24 at this, interesting section where Jesus comes and he starts to promise these things, asking the question of what's next for the disciples. And I just feel like I want to stay in that place for a little bit. Like I want to keep asking that question of what's next. And I want to look at the very last chapter of John this time. But before we get there, I want to back up a little bit. Because I think if we ask the question of what's next and we're really optimistic and hopeful and looking forward into the future, it's an important question for us as Christians in our world today. If we are caught up always looking backward at all of our trauma, looking at all of our baggage and the things that hang us up, it's hard to move forward in life. If we're caught in the moment unsure of how to engage, we're never really fully present with the loved ones around us because we're so caught up in our own heads, we're confused, we're lost, we're distracted. But if we can really think about what's next with Jesus, what's next on this role, what's that mission that God is calling me into, that purpose He's placed on my life, I think we're in a position where we can really see God working and moving around us. Things can happen. And so today what I want to do, we're going to ask the question, what's next again? But we're going to look through the lens of my man, Peter. He gives such a great example. He has such a great story. And really, he's the focal point of this final exclamation point of the chapter of John. One of the best Gospels. Love reading it, But one of the things, if we're going to understand what happens at that moment, we got to understand who Peter is and what his character is. Because as we learn about the character of who Peter is, we're going to learn about the character of God and how He handles what's next. Peter is like the disciple of highs and lows, isn't he? If you kind of look over it, right, and you think about his character, he often gets it wrong. There are many times where he doesn't understand the parable, where he misinterprets the words of Jesus, where he, starts to shoo the children and the babies away from Jesus, and Jesus is like, no, come on back, right? Let the kids come. He fails to continue to walk on water as Jesus calls. Oftentimes he gets it wrong. He misinterprets. He misses the point. And sometimes for Peter, he's constantly comparing. The old who's the greatest question? Oh, Peter, what makes someone ask a question like that? But who among us is the greatest? Just constantly comparing, right? This competition, this jockeying for position, this constantly measuring everybody else up, this measuring success and failure relative to others. You know anybody like that? Are you like that? Right? Success and failure is relative. Who's the greatest? It's like if other people are not doing well, like at least I'm not as bad as that person over there, right? And that whole comparison mentality is really bad because functionally at the end of it all, what happens? You start rooting for other people to lose, don't you? But Peter has this propensity to just compare, and he's constantly comparing. The other thing that he's doing is he's often arguing and rejecting what Jesus is saying. He really just loves to stick his foot in his mouth sometimes, right? Like he wants to argue. He says, Jesus at one point has to say, he says, never, Lord. So many times. He's like, never, Lord. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. You're being a stumbling block right now. Just foot in the mouth, Peter. Sometimes he says, Jesus is washing the disciples' feet, and what does Peter say? You're never going to wash my feet. He says, well, this has to happen or you have no part with me. But he says never, right? And when he's saying never all the time and rejecting what Jesus is saying in these moments, what he's doing is he's really saying that his vision of how things should be is more important, which really is a function of pride. When I think about other moments where Peter is he often shows a weak side to him too. As much as he is strong and he's the rock, he's weak at times as well. I think about falling asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus tells the disciples to pray and he's just snoozing through. Peter denies Jesus in the public arena just before his execution. And Peter's completely overwhelmed with sin at his own self-discovery of his weakness, that he's failed, that he didn't come through. And so whether he's snoozing, whether he's not taking a stand, whether he is just letting his shortcomings and mistakes take him out. Have you ever felt like that? You let your shortcomings, your mistakes, your past, your baggage take you out of the fight that you should be in? What happens is he gets taken out and then he returns to what's familiar. There's a couple specific examples I want to talk about here with Peter. In John 13, this is the denial, right, where Jesus is saying just before he's betrayed, right? So the Gospel of John, there is like a third or a fifth of the chapters are right there in the middle, and it's devoted to Jesus' final night with the disciples. And there's so much great dialogue in that space, and there's so many things, but Jesus comes and he predicts his own betrayal. He says, one of you is going to betray me in John chapter 13. And he says, very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me. And so they're all looking around, who's doing it? And Peter sits back and he says to the disciple who's sitting next to Jesus, he says, hey, ask who he means. Find out who it is, Why is he asking that? Why does he want to know who it is? He's comparing again, All right, who's going to do it? Who's going to be there? And then, again, he gets it wrong because Jesus is telling him what's about to happen in this final week. And he says, my children, I will be with you only a little longer. You'll look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. But a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. And then Peter asks him in verse 36, he says, Lord, where are you going? Jesus says, where I'm going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. Peter says, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. And Jesus says, will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly, I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Peter says, no, I'll die for you. I'm gonna. And Jesus actually says oh, really? Actually, you're even going to deny me 3 times. And so if we fast forward after this evening where Jesus is connecting with the disciples, and now Jesus has been arrested, and in John chapter 18, this is where they ask Peter, right? And so they've kind of taken Jesus into custody, and then Peter's there, and people in the city are beginning to become curious, and they say, aren't you one of the man's disciples, right? And Peter says, I'm not. No, I'm not. It says it was cold. They're gathering around a fire. They're standing, warming themselves. In verse 25, it says that Peter was standing there warming himself, and so they asked him, you aren't one of the disciples too, are you? A second time they ask, and he says, I am not. Very clearly. Denies it. And then one of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him and say, didn't I see you with him in the garden? Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment the rooster began to crow. Are you with that Jesus guy? Nope. I'm pretty sure you're with that Jesus guy, right? I'm pretty sure. Nope, wasn't me. I was there. You chopped off my cousin's ear earlier. I recognize your face. It's got to be you. Nope, wasn't me. And at that moment, he realizes the weight of his betrayal. You see, in this brief moment, right, what Peter does is he's in the comparison mindset. He gets it wrong, and he completely misses the point by saying, never, Jesus. He really rejects and argues, and then he denies, and this shows his weakness. And so what happens is these traits for Peter, it just adds up to this just epic failure. We've walked with Peter through so much of the Gospels, and then here it is at the end, and what happens? There's this failure right when it matters most, when the pressure's on, people are coming for Jesus, when Jesus needs the disciples most, and he has let him down. It's a betrayal. It's a failure. For Peter, it was the end. I don't think we grab the weight of some of this sometimes. Oh yeah, I didn't know him, like we're just trying to kind of hide out. But for a disciple to deny their rabbi, the implications here are astounding. I mean, it's a pretty sharp, it's like, I don't know, working at a restaurant, wadding up your apron, throwing it on the table and being like, I quit, walk out the door, I mean, what he's done in this moment is he kind of quits the team, doesn't he? And so all of this, I'm sure he's felt like all of this time has spent built up, and then he failed, And so all of a sudden he goes from being bold to being kind of broken down. So I'll ask you again, what's next? After failure, when you have come to the end, what's next for Peter? I think at this moment he's got to feel really disconnected from others. He's still kind of around the disciples, but do you feel like he feels like one of them? He's real disconnected. I think he's dejected. He's feeling disqualified. And I think what happens is that as we see the resurrection story play out, don't you think that might just be right in the back of Peter's mind? Even after the resurrection, I just can't help but wonder if he still felt that way. Maybe that's not the way we read it. Maybe that's not the way we understand it. But sometimes we have to look at these stories in the Bible, and really it's to put ourselves in somebody's shoes. And I don't know if it's me. I think I might still feel that way. If we fast forward into John 20, we've got, it's resurrection time, okay? The empty tomb. But I think it's important to remember where Peter's at, because in chapter 20, Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb, sees that the stone has been rolled away from the entrance, so she comes running to Peter and the other disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, and said, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they put him. And so Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter, reached the tomb first. He bent in, he looked in, he saw the strips of linen lying there, but didn't go in. Then Simon Peter finally catches up. He comes along beside him, and he just goes straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. And so then the other disciple goes in, and it says that the other disciple saw and believed. They still did not understand the scripture that Jesus said to rise from the dead. It says in verse 10, then the disciples went back to where they were staying. After this, Jesus appears to Mary, and there's that section where, she feels like, she's like, is this the gardener? Are you the gardener? No, it's the risen Lord Jesus in the flesh. And then what happens is Jesus appears to the disciples in the room, but there's one person notably absent, right? Thomas. Jesus comes back when Thomas is there, right? And he says, hey, put your hand here, like, I'm here. And Thomas even comes to says, my Lord, my God. Jesus says, because you've seen me and you've believed, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And that takes us to this section of chapter 21. And I want to look at these verses with Peter because I think it's important that we ask ourselves some questions about Peter. One of the questions that I have, right, reading the Bible, learning about the Bible is about asking good questions. So I wonder why Peter's the focal point of so many of these stories except for the times where Jesus reappears. He goes to the empty tomb, but notice he's not mentioned at all. Jesus shows up to meet the disciples in the upper room. I wonder, and you can disagree with this because I'm not sure either, but I'm reading the text here. Peter all of a sudden is not one of the focal characters. You notice that? He's almost always mentioned by name. He's almost always front and center, and he's not there. So either he's not there, which would be wild to think about, that he's out on his own somewhere, or if he is there, he's probably sitting back in the corner, isn't he? And so again, I have to ask you, do you think that he may still feel the weight of all of that failure and shame, just feeling like he blew it? Like maybe have you ever been in a room with somebody who's like there physically, but like they are not there? Like I wonder if maybe that's Peter in that moment, as his mind just keeps running back and running back. I don't know. Was he there? Was he in the shadows? I have to think from a storytelling perspective, he had to have been feeling the emotions one way or another. So either way you want to look at it, he's not the focal point of the story anymore. He's probably feeling disconnected, not included. Either he's not in the room, or he's in the room, but he's maybe like not really there. And then all of a sudden, Peter becomes the focal point again in chapter 21. It says Jesus and the miraculous catch of fish. So Jesus shows up after, right? It says, in verse 1, it says, afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee, and it happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together, and Peter says, I'm going out to fish. Okay. Peter's going fishing. Why? Because he's a fisherman. That's what he knows how to do. Maybe he's not feeling like he's included in what's happening anymore. Maybe he's just returning to what's familiar. Maybe he's still in that place of like, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go. Like, maybe I'm just not that brave and bold rock that I thought I was, and I'm going fishing. And here's the other thing that's funny about this, because if you don't see a sense of humor in the Bible, there's some hilarious bits in here if you look at it. He's a fisherman. At least he's going to go back to what he knows, right? Because he's a failure. And what's he doing in the boat? It says, okay, we'll go with you, say the disciples. Early in the morning, let me back up here. In verse 3, it says, I'm going out to fish. Peter told them, and they said, hey, we'll go with you. So they all went out, got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. I'm feeling like a failure, but I'm a fisherman. At least I'll just go fishing. Oh, fail. Continue to fail. Can't even catch the fish. I was going to be a fisher of men, right? Wasn't that the calling that Jesus had? And now I can't even be a fisher of fish. The thing I'm supposed to know how to do. And then the truth is, when Jesus shows up, it says early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore and the disciples didn't realize that it was Jesus. So he calls out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. I'm sure they were really nice about that too. Like, no. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Only with Jesus' miracle powers, right? Oh, you can be a fisherman, but like you need Jesus to do part of that. And one of the things that Peter's going to learn is that he has to rely on Jesus. There's no going back to what it was. There's only moving forward. There's only what's next. So what's next after failure? There's only moving forward, and it's only with Jesus. And in verse 6 here, he says, throw your net on the right side of the boat, right? You'll find some. And they haul up this incredible catch. And then in verse 7, it says, the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. And as soon as Peter heard him saying, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, and he jumped into the water. The other disciples followed by boat, towing the net full of fish, and they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. And when they landed, they saw a fire burning with coals with fish on it and some bread. I love this. This is Peter at his finest, and it's just like, Jesus, I'm going. Like, I wonder by that, it's like, it says he heard somebody say, it's the Lord. I don't even know if he looked or saw. He's just like, okay. There's something great about that, and I just wonder, like, is this the first time he's seen Jesus? Maybe. If not, it's the next time he's seen him and he says, I want to go. I want to be there. I want to be part of what Jesus is doing. And yeah, I've failed, but like I'm going to be the first one there. I'm going to dive out of the boat. I'm not going to wait to paddle over. I'm going to dive in. Interestingly, though, it says he grabs his coat first. Is that comical? Like, I'm just so excited. I don't know. Let me get my stuff together. Is it like, hey, grab your things? Is he just trying to be proper and show the right respect? Like, hey, I got to be button up here and be formal. I don't think so. Because when I think about grab your coat, I think it's saying, all right, I'm ready to go. If we're out together somewhere and I say, hey, why don't you go grab your coat? What does that mean? It's time to go. In England, it's kind of like one of those pop cultural kind of phrases. You know, when somebody embarrasses themselves, they're just kind of like, they say something silly and they're just kind of like, I'll go get my coat. It's a way to say, like, I got to get out of here. But I think for us, it would be more like in a modern, like, hey, get your stuff, let's go. Phone, wallet, keys, like, I don't know what that looks like exactly. But it's like, get your stuff and go. And the perspective I want to have about Peter is that he grabs it because he's ready. He wants to be ready to go. If Jesus says, let's leave right now, I think Peter is there to be ready. I think he's ready to go with Jesus right then and there, and he'll do anything. He's ready to go. And then Jesus sits down and he says, okay, let's eat. So they catch all this fish, and then they sit down and they eat a meal. And they're just together. And isn't that beautiful? Jesus comes back again. He's not just some wispy spiritual like he's real, he's tangible, he's resurrected. Jesus is here and alive. He's eating, they're connecting. They would have shared so many meals together, don't you think? And it would have been like, what a sense of familiarity. We're sitting around, we're eating, we're together. I just can't help but think of Peter's perspective. What would you give to have one of those meals with somebody? You know what I'm saying? Like if you think about somebody that you failed, you blew it with, and then they went away. Maybe it's somebody who's not around anymore. Maybe it's somebody who you've said, I want a second chance at that. What would you do? What would you give to have a chance to just sit and eat a meal together? I think it was a huge moment. It says it's the third time Jesus appeared to the disciples. These numbers of threes, right? Because Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And then in the final section here, in verses 15, he says, Peter, do you love me? In verse 15, it says that after they finished eating, Jesus said to Peter, he said, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. He said, feed my lambs. You love me more than these? These, what's these? What does that mean? It can mean a lot of different things. I have a feeling Jesus is speaking right to that comparison mentality, don't you think? That who's the greatest, like, when he says, like, I love you more than all these people. I'll die for you, Jesus. None of these people are volunteering to die right now, and I'll do it. I will go. And he's always comparing. And Jesus says, do you love me more than everybody here? He says, you know I love you. Feed my lambs, Jesus says. And then Jesus says again, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he answers, he says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he says, take care of my sheep. The third time Jesus comes and he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me? It says that Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him for the third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus says, feed my sheep. Oftentimes you'll hear scholars debate about the word love and what's the interpretation and what's the Greek. So we've all heard about some of this probably over the years in different sermons, right? That there's different words in Greek for the word love. The two that are used here is phileo, which is like brotherly love, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. The idea is like that love for your neighbor. It's neighborly love. There's this other kind of love, agape, which is about unconditional sacrificial love, the kind of love of God coming to earth. Now, you could say, well, they're interchangeable and they're used there. Yeah, I'd agree, but not in the same verse. They're not. This verse uses different forms through all these questions. Do you love me? You know I love you. Do you love me? You know I love you. Do you love me? Lord, you know all things. You know I love you. And what happens is you see some variation there. And Jesus is saying, do you agape love me? Like high level. And Peter says, Lord, you know that I phileo love you. You know I love you. And then that happens the second time. Agape, and then Peter responds with phileo. The third time, though, Jesus, he says, one more time, the same way, he says, do you love me? But he uses the term phileo. And then Peter responds in the same way. Why is that? If you're going to use these terms, you'd probably just pick one for the whole story, wouldn't you? If you were going to develop some kind of a narrative like, yeah, Peter finally gets it and it clicks. He's like, yeah, agape, like, yeah, that's the love I want. Isn't that the love he wants? Doesn't he want to have the unconditional, sacrificial love, the kind of love that would lay down your life? Shouldn't he be there and want to do that? Why doesn't he say that then? I wonder if we might think about this slightly differently, because translation is a tough one, you know? Like, why wouldn't Peter just say the agape? Why would he respond with a different word? It's curious. I wonder if Jesus is saying almost like, Peter's in such a state of failure, he can never get there. He feels completely unworthy. Does that resonate? Like, I've messed up so bad, Jesus, that I know I can't give up to that level, but like, here's what I can do. And I wonder if Jesus changes it, and he almost says like, okay, like, do you even like me? Yeah, Jesus. And I wonder if what Peter's doing is just responding to the very best that he can in that moment. Like, I wonder if rather than being that bold, maybe foolhardy, charge in only to hit your head on something, you know, like the way that Peter did where he was so bold and he said, yeah, I will die for you. I wonder if in this moment he's feeling so failed and defeated and hurt that he says, I can only do this much. And I wonder if the message of grace and love for us today from Jesus is to say, if that's all you can give me right now, I'm okay with that. I wonder if what Jesus is saying is like, I will take your best. Because what happens is to come back from that kind of failure and pain takes time. Healing takes time. I wonder if Jesus is not saying like, follow me now. We'll work toward that. Because I feel like really what Peter's saying is he's saying yes, but he knows he's not good enough. And the way that Jesus responds, you see, Jesus is patient and loving. If that's your best, that's good. There's grace in that message. God loves the humble offering. And Peter needs this sense of restoration with Jesus, the sense of being welcomed back into the mission at hand. Something that deals with that sense of failure, that he's not worthless. All hope is not lost. There is still hope. He can still be made new. Might take him a little time. I don't know. But he's going to need that if he's going to feed my sheep, isn't he? So the charge for Jesus is like, no, you're in the mid, like, be the shepherd here. That was your calling. That's who you are. Yeah, you failed, but I'm welcoming you back. There's a restoration here in this story of Peter. And then in verse 18, right? Jesus tells him a preview, and he says, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself, went where you wanted to go. But when you are old, you'll stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the type of death by which Peter would glorify God, and then he said to him, follow me. The message from Jesus is, do you love me? Even if you're beat up and broken down, do you love me, and will you still be a part of what I've called you to be? Peter will lead the church coming out of this. But if there's not this moment of restoration, it never happens. He needed this moment to be able to feed the sheep. And then what Jesus says is actually there's going to be a day that's coming soon. You failed it last time, Peter. But there's going to be a time. There's going to be a time where people lead you by the hand and you go where you don't want to go. And it says it indicates the kind of death that Peter would have, just like his Lord, right? And so when he says, I will follow you to death, Jesus says, you're going to get your chance. Because you're fully restored in the kingdom of God. Jesus has such a good plan for you. Like, you may think it's all lost. You missed your moment and it's gone forever. And Jesus says, no, we got more in store. God's not really surprised when things don't go right. Did you know that? He says, you'll get your chance. And I think in those moments, you'll respond to me with agape, won't you? Yeah. He says, follow me. Face your task like I did. Be the disciple again. You're restored and you are commissioned. The character of Peter tells us a lot about the character of God. When we feel like we've lost the whole plot and that we're no longer part of the mission and we've just blown it and failed, failure after failure, what God does is comes and says, you're not a failure. This is all part of the plan, and I got more for you to do, in fact. That is a message of hope and optimism. And if we're looking forward and saying what's next, the character of God, every time that Peter gets it wrong and completely misinterprets what Jesus is doing, what does he do? He pulls him in, he teaches him, he corrects him, he instructs him. Every time he starts to argue and says, never, 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 what does he do? He doesn't just tell him to get lost. Every time that he rejects an idea, he starts to argue. Jesus doesn't push him away. Even up to the point of denial and failure. See, the character of God, he's not going to go away just because of that. The character of God, God relates to us in those times of sin and failure, when we get it wrong, when we are weak, and God gives us patience and grace and love. That's the gospel, and that's the good news. And when we mess up, God finds ways to restore us, to bring us back. That's the kind of good news that changes the world. What's next is follow me. Follow me and go forward. That you can be made new, you can be restored. You're still part of what's happening here. You're still important. You're still valued. It doesn't matter how many times you make mistakes. You can come back. I'm going to help you, and we're going to move forward. And I'm going to go back to that command here because what Jesus is doing in Peter's life, again, this is about the character of God reflected in the character of Peter. He goes back to that command in John 13. He says, a new command I give you, you love one another. As I've loved you, you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciple if you love one another. This is our call and our commission in the world today, is to love one another. We are not called to correct everyone around us, to form arguments, to rebuke everyone around us. This is not our calling. Our calling is to love others. Why? Because they're going to know we're disciples of Jesus if we love well. Peter is not just going to feed my lambs, feed my sheep. Peter's not being called to that just because he's earned a position. You know, this whole ego thing that he had has really been stamped down. What it is, it's the quality and how much he loves Jesus. The empowerment for Peter to be the head of the church is that he loves Jesus so completely. That's actually the thing that God wants to fuel. Because he says, if you're going to love my people, you got to love the way I love. It's got to be agape. And Peter's up for it. And there's good news in this, right? The gospel perspective is that even when we get it wrong and we miss the point, Jesus instructs us without rejection. He teaches and reminds us what is important and what is true. And he's not just coming around being like, let me tell you what you're doing wrong. Do you know how many people in our world are so fast to tell us what we're doing wrong? They're everywhere. The voices, it's incessant. It's mind-numbing how many people are like, you know what you need to do? Oh, geez, can we just not go there, please? What people don't need is another verbal slapdown of all the things that they're doing incorrectly in their life. What people need is a message of love and grace and hope and optimism. The kind of message that Peter gets there, where he says, "Do you love me? Lord, you know I love you." Good, you got work to do. When we're constantly comparing, and we fall into that mentality where success and failure is all relative to others, God gives us our own path. He says, "I got a mission for you. I got a story for you. Don't worry about them." You know, right after this bit, in the very last section of chapter 21, right after Jesus says, "Follow me," in verse 20, Peter turns and he sees the disciple whom Jesus had loved as following them. This is the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the Last Supper and said, "Lord, who's going to betray you?" He's the one who said, "Hey, find out who it is," because he's comparing. And so he finds him again. He says, "Well, okay, God, but what about him?" I love that. And in verse 22, Jesus answers, he says, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what's that to you? You have to follow me." And again, what God is doing is he's bringing him in, right? If he's alive until I return, what's that to you? What's that got to do with your story? What does that have to do with what I've called you to do? And I would hope that in this moment, Peter realizes and says, okay, I have my path. It doesn't matter what other people are doing. I have a path and a calling, and so the way out of constant comparison, it just kills people. Always constantly judging and comparing and measuring and keeping score. If we don't live our life walking with Jesus with a clear direction and a clear path and a purpose and a calling, we will just be blown around and scattered, and we will come to the end and say, what did I even do? Whereas if we walk in purpose that God gives us, our relationship with God becomes the barometer of our success. How connected I am to God is now about how good I'm doing. It's not how good I'm doing in relative to old so-and-so over here who's totally blowing it. And if our relationship with God is our barometer for success, that means, you know what isn't our barometer for success? Public opinion. That means sometimes you're going to have to step out. That means sometimes you're going to have to be willing to take a stand. And not in the argumentative way, right? Because what Peter does, right, that rejecting mentality, that saying, never, that kind of argumentative streak, that rebellious tone that he takes sometimes about his vision and his own pride and what he thinks should happen and how he thinks the world should go, and how God responds is with openness and listening. That's how we should be living. We should be open to what God's saying. We should be listening for God's direction, not always arguing and asserting our own opinions. Letting Jesus lead and walking behind him is what it means to be a disciple. Being a Christian is being a disciple of Jesus. We're called to follow Jesus. That means you have to let him lead. And even when Peter would have these moments of weakness where he fell asleep, where he didn't take a stand, where he wouldn't say what was uncomfortable, where he let all of his shortcomings and mistakes just take him completely out, the gospel really says that strength in Jesus and focus on mission is what we should be about. That we can take a stand in truth, and that there's no fear in the perception of others around us because we're confident in what God's called us to do. We let God inform our identity and who we are. We let God's mission help move us forward and on to what's next, because what Jesus is calling is he's saying, follow me, and we're going to go forward. That's a beautiful message to failure. If we say what's next in terms of failure, we answered some good questions last week, and I want to leave you with a few more this week. What's next for the failure? The person who feels like they blew it. I missed my chance. I screwed up so bad, you don't even know. You cannot even comprehend how bad I've been. You hear this all the time, and people what are you doing? You're comparing yourself. Stop it. What do you want to have, a contest on who's been the worst? First of all, no one wins that. Second of all, somebody's always done something worse than you, so just leave it alone already. When Jesus is saying, I've come to give you healing and hope, you think, oh yeah, but only to a certain extent? Is that the good news? The good news of the kingdom is that it says no matter what you've done, Jesus is offering forgiveness, love, grace, restoration, hope, and a future. That's the good news. That's the kind of message we should be getting excited about and sharing with people. The kind of message that we just can't stop. We can't help from sharing with people. And when people say, like, why are you so stubbornly happy? It's just weird, right? You say, like, because Jesus changed my life. I got to let go of all that failure. So what's next for the failure? There's loving correction from God when we go to Him. Pursuing that relationship with Jesus, spending time in prayer, talking with other Christian friends who can help see what God's doing in our life and let us know what's happening and what they see. That loving correction is what gets us beyond failure and we move on. And it may not happen all at once. You may only have so much to give at that point. But start today, take a first step, and know that the healing takes time, but you can get there. That's hope. You know, we can swap and just say, what's next from someone who just is obsessed with this comparison mentality? It seeps into every facet of your life. It's sneaky, y'all. It's real sneaky. And if you're obsessed with that, what Jesus is offering you today is your own sense of calling, your life, the work you have to do. We all have different circles we operate in. I love church because this whole model of like church where we gather and then we go out. We gather, we go out. That's what we do. And we come here to like thank God for what He's doing, to see what He's doing in other people's lives, to make a connection, to recharge our batteries, and then we go out. And when we go out, you're going to your own little world. You've got your own thing to do. You each have your own story to be writing. Each of you has work to do. So instead of comparing yourself to other people, well, I'm doing better than so-and-so, well, at least I'm not that bad, or I don't know, I wish I had what they had, all of those things don't matter if you know your purpose and your calling. And that's what a relationship with Jesus offers you, is a clear sense of calling and direction. I know what I need to do. I know what's important. I'm connected. What's next for the proud? I think humble discipleship is there. And if you go to Jesus and say like, well, Jesus, I'm going to give you my life. It ain't perfect. I don't have it all together. I'm not even confident right now that I ever will. But I'll give you everything I got and I'll walk with you. And wouldn't you just be so surprised what He can do with you? And if you're just weak, the message is what's next for someone who feels that weakness, that sense of failure and shame. It's strength and courage and grace and love. This is the message of what Jesus is offering us today. So what's next? What's next is following Jesus. What's next is moving forward. And what's next is really, truly leaving failure behind and becoming the people that we've been called to be. Amen.